I am Tom, founder of Demand Genius and host of Demand Geniuses. This show is all about equipping B2B marketers with everything they need to convert demand to revenue. So please hit the follow button, it makes me really happy, and then enjoy the show. Everyone, welcome to another episode of Demand Geniuses. I'm going to get straight into it today and just introduce my guest, which is Louis Fernandes. And well, rather than do a bad job of giving your background, Louis, do you want to just give us all a quick introduction into you?
Oh, yeah. Hi. Well, firstly, thanks very much for having me on the show, Tom. Really appreciate being here. So I'm Louis Fernandes. I've been in SaaS as an industry now for over 20 years. And been in industry itself for over 36, which is either really good or a little bit depressing. I started life off actually as a client-side marketer in B2C, and then went from marketing ultimately via agency to sales in technology. So that's kind of been my journey over that 36 odd years, with little stints doing bits and pieces of skiing and sailing in between, but that's a story for another day. Spent the last decade, I guess, in revenue leadership roles, running effectively SaaS scale-ups and their revenue functions. So that's me in a nutshell.
Nice. And I saw there was a stop at Mark Warner along the way, which sounds quite fun. There was a little bit of time in banking, I think, which I'll forgive you for. That sounds less fun.
It's where I, funnily enough, cut my teeth on marketing. So, it was proper B2C, retail banking marketing kind of thing. And it was very good in terms of, this was in the days when banks still ran apprenticeships. So I was, in fact, on a banking apprenticeship. And we went around learning all sorts of things about finance, about law, about sales, about marketing. So it was quite a good education from that perspective. But
Nice. I think the art of like the early career rotation has been lost a little bit, right? Because everything is about like filling a very specific role or specialization. Quite difficult. We're going off on a tangent already, but let's go down it briefly. I always think it's really hard at the start of your career because you're meant to know what to do and what you want to do. And I'm like, I remember when I was 22, I didn't have a clue what I wanted to do. And there isn't the same like testing ground to go and work that out anymore, is there?
Yeah, I think that's partly true. And I think that's one of the reasons that I think some of the stuff we're going to be talking about today around, sales and marketing alignment and those kind of things and how you operate in a whole GTM function, actually, from a very formative kind of point of view, the stuff that I did in banking is actually quite related because I went round, as you say, different departments and learned about how business functions, as opposed to just how sales functions or just how marketing functions. And I think as a consequence of which you learn to see things from other people's points of view as well, which is particularly helpful when you then move into leadership roles. It's not just about what's right for your function. You have to look much broader and think about it in the context of what are the objectives for the business and also for the people within it. And how you bring people together to collaborate. So that changes the dynamic somewhat.
Yeah, well, I think everything's so vertically specialized now, right? That it's difficult to get the like broad perspective across the organization. And as your role moves a little bit away from being like head of director level cheerleader for your function and towards C-level cheerleader for the business and advocate for what is best in the aggregate, it's probably quite a harder jump to make if you don't have the early career exposure that traditionally you would have gotten to everything else.
Agree.
Anyway, we digress. So I guess going back to 30-something in your career, is there a step in that you would say, I always like to ask this, that you would say it was particularly formative for you? And I guess you might think in terms of progression, but also just your thinking and your mindset.
Yes. Actually, it was towards the end of my tenure at NatWest, where, this was being 93, 94. And I'd been at the bank for probably 5-6 years at the time, getting on for 7 years. And we were in the middle of the last, what I want to think of as the last big recession. This is the time when people were literally posting the keys for their houses back through letterboxes because they were effectively in negative equity. Anyway, at that time, the bank offered everybody voluntary redundancies, and I took one. And so it's the first time suddenly at the age of about 25 that I was out of work. And that's when I decided to head over to the Alps and become a ski bum. And I have to say that changed my life. Quite literally. It's amazing. You suddenly find yourself in an unfamiliar country, working in an industry you know nothing about. And you're in at the deep end and kind of making it up as you go along. But again, those formative things that we spoke about a minute ago really translated through. And suddenly you're running a P&L, you're running a business, you're running, the sales and the marketing, the whole bloody lot. And actually it gave me a real appreciation for go-to-market, but just not in a SaaS context. What was really interesting was a few years after I made that move, I was still working in sort of the ski industry, and I set up my own company because clearly at the age of then about 28, 29, I knew everything that there was to know about the ski industry, or at least I thought I did, and set this thing up, and I then went bust within 12 months. That, in terms of the lessons you learn, better than any education I've ever had, has stood me in really good stead throughout. And now when I'm approaching things like go-to-market, I'm always thinking of it in terms of it's like having your own money. What are you going to do with it? How are you going to de-risk what you're doing, but still get to the result that you need to get to? And I think that that's been particularly useful through the age of free money, when everybody sort of was spending willy-nilly on all sorts of go-to-market initiatives, in inverted commas, that were, in a lot of instances, a pile of shit and just didn't really go anywhere. And then suddenly, fast forward to, the post-COVID era, where you've got interest rates really high, money is no longer free. Pretty much every single SaaS business that I know out there has got some sort of path to profitability project on the run. Because guess what? They didn't understand their unit economics. They were frivolous with money to start off with, scaled people without having the scale of business to support it. And quelle surprise, look where we are now.
Yeah, well, and I guess a lot of those companies must have found themselves with people who are very ill-equipped to deal with that, right? Because a lot of it is the people who were stars of a company during the kind of zero interest rate period where it's just about throwing cash at problems, right? And so I know you've recently kind of set yourself up as a revenue advisor with Magnitude 10, right? But I guess it must be that experience from earlier in your career where the fundamentals of business are a lot more in the kind of crosshairs must have stood you in pretty good stead.
Yeah, I mean, I remember one of the very first bosses turning around to me and basically reciting an old adage back at me: revenue for vanity, profit for sanity. Who knew that was a thing, right? Yeah, I look at today's paradigm and everybody's scrambling for how do we hit EBIT numbers? How do we make sure that we're actually getting some return on capital employed? How are we actually creating free cash flow? Now, again, go back to banking, at least I understand what these terms are, right? Because it was stuff that was important then. But a lot of people use the terminology without really understanding how these things operate or the unit economics that sit behind them. And that, again, is a huge advantage when you're then talking about how do you really set up a go-to-market function for success.
Yeah, okay. Well, and then help me. So let's get into that a little bit then. So what would you say the biggest differences are? And let's focus on companies where you're setting up a go-to-market motion, maybe, rather than trying to claw it back a little bit, which I think is a whole different question and probably a much harder task. Like, in terms of, let's say I've just raised a Series A, I'm looking to build an efficient go-to-market motion. What are like the fundamentals that you focus on day one now, and how does that maybe differ to 10 years ago or 5 years ago?
This is the thing. I think certainly my thinking hasn't changed that much over that time, but how thinking per se has changed, I think, is quite a lot. I mean, let's start with the fundamentals. The fundamentals don't change, and anybody who's ever studied Kotler will think of the 4 Ps of marketing: product, price, place, promotion. And you sit there and you go, well, how do I apply that to GTM? Well, the first thing is what's my product? What is the product actually, solving a problem for? It can have all the bells and whistles in the world, but if it's not actually solving a real world problem and has a real world use case, and I don't have a proper vision of what my MVP is, then what the hell am I doing? If I don't understand what it is I'm solving for, and I think it might be this, or I think it might be that, or I could be all things to all people, well, then I'm screwed before I even start. So being able to really understand what my proposition is, really understand which markets it serves, and then understanding really in detail those intricacies of my ICP, my ideal customer profile, that match that, that's absolutely fundamental. So I think that's where I would always start.
Because I think that was something that was also in focus, has always been in focus, right? The difference has been potentially the way that you then allocate resources to go after that particular ICP. I'm one of these people, right? I've kind of been trained as such over the last 8 years or so. And ICP has always been a very front of mind thing that you're educated on very early coming into any commercial role. So it wasn't that was ignored. Like, where do you think the problem came in how we used to operate before? Because we still did look at these fundamentals. We just seemed to make bad decisions off the back of it.
Right. Okay. Quite straightforward. You might think about your ICP. How many people actually really enforce it? And this is where the problem lies. Because what we do is we then build compensation structures that reward people for closing deals, regardless of who the deal is with, whether it's the right deal or the wrong deal for the company, which is paying on revenue. So immediately you start going down that kind of a route, and it becomes, well, so long as I can line my pockets, what do I care whether it actually fits an ICP or not? It doesn't matter to me. I still get paid. And that's where bad behaviors then start creeping in. And because people aren't paying attention to that, you then end up effectively selling things to people that were never a good ICP fit for you in the first place. And certainly probably not right for the proposition. At which point you implement something, it doesn't go well because it was never going to be a fit in the first place. They churn, your cost of acquisition goes through the roof, and your lifetime value is in the toilet. There's your problem.
Yeah, and it's interesting. It comes back to me, what I hear there is it comes back to a similar problem to what we spoke about before right at the start, which is specialization. And I think one of the things we did very smartly in SaaS is we realized that it makes sense in a commercial function to specialize and have different people own different chunks of the buyer journey and things like that. But what we probably did that I don't think was that smart is we built KPIs around those specialisms, and that kind of distracted everyone from the broader goal. So as a content marketer, you got your KPIs around top of funnel metrics. You then move down funnel in marketing and then into sales, and everyone owns just their piece. We got very fancy with how we try and attribute that to the whole, but it leads to people going after the wrong things. So how would you approach it differently in terms of structuring something now, right? Like if you were going to go into a new organization, how would you approach aligning like creating incentives for different teams in a way that gives people ownership, which I think is what that system does very well, but so still keeps everyone's eye on the broader prize?
So it starts with the overarching objective. What is the job to be done? What are we trying to achieve? And then you have to be really specific about how you define it. We are looking to achieve XYZ revenue growth in these markets, selling to this ICP with this proposition, right? So everybody then needs to align around that. So we start building out comp plans. Personally, it's not about things like getting really tactical around, well, actually what I need is I'm going to pay somebody on a number of leads. Who cares? Do those leads convert? Do those conversions lead to revenue? And do they lead to revenue in the ICP accounts we've defined? If the answer is no, why am I going to pay for that? So you've got to get aligned around making sure you understand what is it that we're paying for that drives the behaviors, and compensation drives behavior. Who knew that? So you get to the result that you want. If you're not aligning around that result, and this is across all departments, then any surprise that you don't get there.
I think the challenge is, and like, I guess because I'm completely with you, I guess to play devil's advocate a little bit, what the flip side is everyone focuses on the single North Star, which is always my approach, right? Of revenue, but you then lose ownership of your goal a little bit, right? Which I think is another challenge.
But I challenge you on that, Tom. Is it just revenue, or is it profitable, sustainable, predictable revenue? This is where the definitions become important. Because if you just say, actually, well, I'm interested in revenue growth, okay, I can get some short-term revenue growth and I might sacrifice next year to achieve this year's targets. But then it becomes about sustainable, predictable, repeatable, all those good things into the right ICP with the right value proposition. And there were some solid lessons there from other people. We only have to look as far as things like a book I'm sure you're familiar with, Crossing the Chasm. I mean, Geoffrey Moore talks very, very eloquently about don't start picking off too much too early, because you end up blancmanging and getting distracted. And the same is true with multiple different sales motions. You're too early in your revenue journey to suddenly have 3, 4, 5 different sales motions targeting different segments, because you don't have the scale structure or resources to be able to do it. And then guess what? Your economies of scale don't work out. So your unit economics collapse. Suddenly your profitability's down the toilet. It all becomes a vicious cycle. So you've got to really think about these things and be very intentional about which markets you're entering, when you're entering those markets, which customers you're serving, what is it you're serving them with, what are the problems you're trying to solve for, and can you do it in a sustainable way? And then you align the teams around those, North Star goals.
Yeah, well, and that's where when in organizations I've been in, I've seen all of this break down. If we're talking about sales and marketing alignment, that's when it breaks down, right? Is when you don't have that intentionality. And so people are going after volume in their isolated, kind of arena, right? And then I was always on I think we both got a foot in both the sales and marketing side, but I was on the enterprise sales side, and you get that classic thing where you're getting leads through, the leads get ignored because they're not good leads and things like that. So I think what always makes that difficult in practice is the way that we're funded and the kind of short-term cycles that we operate on, right? So typically as a startup, you raise and you give yourself 18 to 24 months of runway, and everything becomes about hitting the next milestone within that. Like, do you think it's almost just an inevitable consequence of the VC model that we typically rely on, though, that you have that element of short-termism and trying to cram as much into that next window as you can?
I think it's as much about expectation management, right? So I'm desperate for funding. I go to a VC. I've got this deck that has all these KPIs that we're going to hit in the next 12 to 24 months, none of which I've actually bothered really calculating, but it just sounds good on a pitch deck to get my money. Now I've got my money. Hurrah! Now guess what? I'm now tied back to those metrics that I plucked out of thin air and didn't really think about. And, the VCs haven't got a clue anyway, because they're like, yeah, great, fantastic. This is a punt we're prepared to take. One of many, or at least that's how it was. I think it's a little bit harder now, and people are educating themselves a bit better now about what the risks are involved in a particular proposition, and certainly in the market they're entering into. Because let's face it, the majority of software categories today are red oceans, right? There are the very few categories that are blue oceans. The big opportunity that everybody's now grasping onto is AI, because everybody's got funding for an AI project, right? Whether I know what I'm going to do with it or not is a completely different conversation, but that's not the point. What I care about is the fact that there is the AI piece there, and suddenly I'm going to, put all my eggs in that basket and off I go. The right question to be asking is to say, actually, if we want to create blue oceans, it's about how do we apply the AI to particular use cases and then show people what the art of the possible is. And it goes back to education. And it's sort of a slightly different model to the one that we've been used to for probably the last 10 years.
Yeah, well, and it's something that gives me hope, right, is that I think one of the challenges, if I put myself in the shoes of a marketer here, right, is that a lot of these expectations are put on you. And so you may know the way that you ought to operate and what kind of good marketing or the right thing looks like, but it's very difficult to do that in the face of all this pressure. Like, I think as traditional software companies are no longer like the shiny, sexy thing for funding, it hopefully means that better practices or better, more realistic expectations cascade down, and it makes it actually easier for the person at the end of the chain. I guess from your experience, and it's quite interesting, I'm trying to kind of translate this down to folks who are working a little bit more on the ground. From your experience in the kind of C-suite of these organizations, what advice would you give to a marketer who maybe is feeling pressure to make what you would say are bad decisions in terms of how they can kind of push back against that?
Know your numbers. Know your numbers. Be commercial about it. You know, it's one of these things. This is where the intersect between what we think of as B2B marketing, and you know, we've got ourselves to blame sometimes on this front, where we say actually B2B marketing, it's more about, you know, demand creation and getting leads. It's not. We need to think about marketing in terms of the full marketing mix. It's a strategic function that determines which markets we enter into, how we position our proposition, how we even do things like pricing and packaging of those products and services, and think about it in terms of what is the impact that it makes then to top line. So as if I was a CMO, I'd be saying I want to have ownership of the revenue number, because we have to be contributing towards it in a meaningful way. Likewise, if I'm a CRO, again, absolutely, I have accountability for the revenue number, but I'd also be sitting there thinking about what do I need to do to create that sustainable sort of cycle of incoming pipeline. Tactically, if I'm just thinking about demand generation and creating a volume of leads, that's a zero-sum game. It doesn't lead anywhere. I need to be thinking longer term. What am I doing from a brand perspective? And actually, one of the go-to bits of work that I think I would encourage any B2B marketer or any B2B revenue leader, CRO, VP sales to look at is some of the work that Les Binet and Peter Field did, the long and the short of it. You know, having a look at how does brand activation really interact with sales activation and understanding those paradigms. So that would be my sort of guidance on that.
And give us a little bit more context, because I'm not actually familiar with that work. Give us a little bit more context on what that was.
So the long and the short of it talks to long-term and short-term implementation of marketing strategies. The majority of B2B marketers, they will look at, again, I'm running a campaign to create demand so that we drive pipeline for this quarter, next quarter. Very few people think about brand. Yet, if you look at the biggest brands that there are in software, they're like the Salesforces of the world, the Oracles, the SAPs. We sort of look at those, and the Microsofts, we sort of look at them and we go, but hang on a minute, we're startups, we're cool, we're hip. Why are you in business in the first place? Because you want to become one of those mega vendors. That's your ultimate goal. You want to make the money. You want to drive the revenues. Look at what they've done. They have brand presence. They're front of mind for every Tom, Dick and Harry out there that's in a buying cycle. And the ones that are the category leaders in any particular software category, they're the ones that, funnily enough, invest in brand. That's what I mean. So long-term bit, a long-term brand activation. Actually, brand activation is just long-term sales activation. That's what it is. You're front of mind. People know who you are. They know what you stand for. So when I enter into a buying cycle at that top of funnel, I'm thinking about your brand ahead of anybody else's. And we hear so much about the dark funnel these days, 70% or 80% or whatever number it happens to be this week of the buyer journey is completed without ever involving anybody from sales. Well, if that's the case, you need to be present in that dark funnel so that actually when people are making purchase decisions, you're part of the consideration set.
A lot of what we've described, what we've talked about here, I think, is that historically there's been a bit of a tipping of the scales overly towards short term. And what we're starting to see is people accept there needs to be a little bit of a recalibration, at the very least, somewhere back into the middle. I think it's interesting hearing you talk about brand as well, because it's something that someone who's from, I would often expect someone who's from more of a CRO type background to kind of roll their eyes a little bit at brand, right? Because I think historically brand has some quite unhelpful connotations of unmeasurable, kind of wishy-washy marketing, like, oh, we're working on brand, is kind of proxy for we're not doing anything tangible and we can't show that we're having an impact.
Tell that to any marketing executive at Unilever. It drives sales. It's like, you know what? The way that the problem that you have is that a lot of the B2B marketers that are out there haven't understood what brand is because they haven't come up through a traditional, marketing route. You go to any FMCG marketer, they understand the power of brand. Not only that, but a brand director in FMCG, they are responsible for revenue. They own the P&L, they own the revenue number, and they own the market share. And woe betide you if you make that disappear in any way, shape, or form. Can you imagine if you own something like Pampers as a brand, or Kleenex, or Gillette? This is about sales, kid yourself not. And the amount of money they invest in brand has a direct relationship to the revenue that it drives for those businesses. In the same way that if you look at Salesforce is a great example in a B2B context, the value of the brand at Salesforce, they reckon if you wanted to achieve the same output, you would have to spend $3 billion a year recurring to get the same impact that Salesforce has achieved because of its brand. And whether you think it's a great product or whether you think it's had its heyday and it's a bit of a me too, doesn't matter. It's still got share of mind.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and I know that there's a lot of talk about where you can find a bit of a moat these days, right? And generally speaking, technology is not the moat it was. And one of the last ways a lot of people would say that you can establish a moat is by building a brand. The other thing I think is useful is I think just changing the perception of what exactly constitutes brand. Like in my definition, brand is less about like the flashy activation that you've done and a lot more about the fundamentals of who are we, as you said, who are we, who do we serve, and how do we build a narrative that stems from that and goes through every element of the business, right? Every touch point that we have with customers, and build kind of an element of story into that. From a content marketer's perspective, that comes down to understanding, okay, what's our content IP? What's our unique perspective on the world, and how can we make that flow consistently through campaigns? Whereas I think what brand has often become associated with is particular channels that are long-term and hard to track.
Yeah. But again, I think this is one of the big confusions of tracking and attribution. Right. So in so many organizations, we have this deceit or conceit that it's all about attribution, because why am I actually looking to measure attribution? So that I can get credit for achieving X or Y or Z, because that's how I get paid. Rather than the right way to look at it is to say, the reason I want to track attribution is so that I can understand what I need to tweak to get the best possible result and optimize our revenue engine. Very few organizations use it for the latter. Everybody's looking at it for the former. Not only that, but actually I have a bit of a bugbear around attribution, because most people do it in either a first touch, last touch, or a W kind of attribution model. Actually, if you want to do proper attribution, you need to go to econometric modeling, which is expensive and complicated, and nobody really does it.
Well, and I think the challenge that you get has a really damaging effect within organizations. People start just optimizing for the model, right? People work out how to game a model very quickly, and they start building for that. How would you say, so where does that leave you in terms of the way that you approach attribution? Is it something that you will focus on when you come into an organization but do it right, or is it something that you just think not doable and therefore let's not try?
It's not that it's not doable, it's just not a high priority. The real priority is making sure that we are selling into our ICP and selling consistently. So let's make sure that we understand how our revenue model works, first of all. So number one, what are we doing in terms of net new names? Number two, and this is again something that I think a lot of CROs get wrong, because most CROs come from a net new name background. Let's be honest. But what they're not then paying enough attention to is what's happening in terms of retention, and what are we doing in terms of expansion into existing accounts? Because again, the way that an ARR business works is that it's maintaining the annually recurring revenues and then building on those with either expanding into those existing accounts or winning new ones. When you get to a certain scale, so we talked about some of the mega vendors, The mega vendors aren't really selling any net new names. What they're doing is they're churning the existing accounts they have with new propositions, new capabilities, expanding the footprints. That's how they're making their money, because very few people are not working with those guys, right? If you think about, say, Office 365, people are moving from one instance to the next, and then they bolt on Teams and they bolt on something else. But very few are actually saying, well, actually, I'm buying this for the first time. So it depends where you as a business are on your revenue journey. And it is very different from 0 to 1, 1 to 5, 5 to 10, 10 to 20, 20 to 50. That's where you're starting to really scale. And it really becomes about that retention piece. 50 to 100, we're looking at not just retention, we're really getting into expansion. And they quickly outstrip net new names, quickly. And that's where you need to then start focusing your attention on what elements within my revenue model are the ones where I need to be focused on. So I start thinking about, again, what are the important metrics that matter in my business? Net retention rates, gross retention rates. You know, we focus on ARR. I always think about ARI, and it's not a financial measure. It's annually recurring impact. If I continue to have impact with my customer, guess what? They'll spend more money with me. Rather than I don't focus on the customer and I'm more focused on winning new business, and we end up in the classic Kotler world of the leaky bucket.
What role do you think marketing has to play in delivering impact? Because I often think that that's one thing that's actually quite often overlooked.
I think it's really important to be able to then articulate the impact that you're having for existing customers and turn that into not just case studies, but reasons why people would buy. It's interesting. I was having this conversation just the other day, and we were talking about sales methodologies. So things like spin selling, challenger, those kind of things. Let's take spin selling, really, really simple. So the acronym, if for those that don't know it, S, situation, P, problem, I, implication, N, needs payoff. If I break that down, the situation, the pain, and the implication are all things that as marketers we can talk about. So what I could be saying is something along the lines of, this is a customer we've worked with that looks like you. This is the paradigm they were in, facing these kind of challenges that everybody in that operating model faces, macro environmental, competition amongst rivals, whatever it happens to be. These are the specific problems they had within that context. This is how they went about approaching it. Changing some of the methods of operating, transforming X or Y or Z, whatever it happens to be. Oh, and by the way, this is how we help them do that. A piece of technology may have been a part of that solution. Let's talk about that briefly, very briefly. Then we turn around and we say, and these were the outcomes. This is the change of paradigm before and after. And we're using classic storytelling. And in fact, there's a sales methodology that talks exactly to this command of the message. It's about having that consistency of message ultimately throughout every interaction that we have, from marketing to sales to CS. It's a consistent story, and we take people on the journey with us. And it reminds me a little bit of something classic that, in, what was it, 2009, when Simon Sinek first burst onto the scene with Start With Why. And he said, people don't buy what you do, they buy why you do it. Classic storytelling.
Well, I guess where I was getting at with my question is often that I think marketing and that storytelling element often ends at signing a customer, right? We think a lot about go-to-market efficiency increasingly, but what we don't necessarily think about is like the efficiency with which we're able to deliver value. And there's still a lot of emphasis then on that always being either a product or a customer success problem to solve post-purchase, rather than something where actually marketing can add awful lot of value to adoption, to educating on new use cases, but it's often not a priority. Have you seen anyone do that well? And is it something that you've seen become more of a focus? Or?
Yeah, and it's interesting, actually. I don't know how familiar you are with the folks at Winning by Design. So Winning by Design, yeah, West Coast, Jacco van der Kooj, if you've never had any interaction with him, he's worth talking to. Brilliant guy. super motivational and gets it. But what he's talking about with things like the bow tie model is that it doesn't stop at close. In fact, he doesn't even recognize close. He talks about mutual commitment. He talks about first impact. And then he talks about that recurring impact over time. And this is where, traditional sales models always stop at, we've closed a deal. Hurrah. It's not. That's the start of your engagement, really. That's what the start of which I've made a commitment to you and I've promised you an outcome and a result. Now I've got to deliver that and prove I can do what I said I would do. That's where the recurring impact happens. That's where we build trust. That's the point at which I open the door to you being able to say to me, Louis, I trust you because you've delivered on your earlier commitment. What else can you do for me?
And then I guess, so last question on this, and then I'm conscious of time, we can get into some quick fires. I think there'll be a lot of CMOs and heads of marketing who listen to this and like, this all sounds great. That's exactly how I want to operate. They feel held back by the fact that they probably sit under either a CEO who doesn't quite get the kind of things that you're talking about, or one of those CROs that used to be the best sales rep in the organization and has gone up to CRO that way. Like, what would any practical advice for them to start trying to create this change internally when maybe they're not completely empowered to do so and they are held back by their current isolated goals?
Again, it's all about the numbers. Follow the money, as I think it was famously said during Watergate. Understand the economic model, understand it as well as your peers in revenue, and be part of that conversation. Be commercial. Don't just be marketing. Be able to talk finance. Be able to talk these other languages. So this is the whole point. The reason I think a lot of organizations failed is because the people at that sort of C-suite level don't speak each other's languages. Yeah, one of the things that we learned from Challenger, if nothing else, was it was teach, tailor, take control. So maybe educate people about how things could be done differently. Tailor your message depending on the audience you have, and then that allows you to take control.
Yeah, well, it's funny. It's one of my kind of bugbears at the moment is I think marketers often suffer with the fact that they're kind of put in a box within their organization and they find it very hard to break out of that. But it's ironic because the core skill set typically of a marketer and a content marketer is storytelling and building a narrative. What I think typically they do a very bad job of is directing that energy internally. It's all directed out kind of externally. And I think that's where there's a big opportunity to kind of evangelize what you could do.
Totally. And when I made the transition from marketing to sales, guess what I did? I did exactly that. I just started storytelling internally to win effectively support for some of the initiatives I wanted to do. And, within sales organizations, particularly at SaaS, SAS that is, and HPE, I have license to do some really innovative stuff. Because in these monolithic organizations, because I was talking about commercial outcomes that had impact.
Yeah, let's do some quick fire questions. An AI use case or an AI tool that you love that just blew your mind?
I just use ChatGPT lots, and I use it as a sparring partner.
Nice. I think that's one of the biggest ways that it's changed my life is just like the immediate feedback on something. I don't expect it to give me anything massively new, but it can kind of help me unlock new ways of my own thinking.
Yeah, and I think that's the right way of viewing it, because a lot of people use it as a substitute for critical thinking. I use it as a way of augmenting my own critical thinking.
Yeah, and I do that as well sometimes, but it's something I have to catch myself on. I think it's very easy to forget how to think these days. Second question. So for you personally in your career, what's like a skill or a trait that would you say has been the biggest needle mover for you?
Being able to span both sales and marketing. That's my superpower.
Nice. What is there a way that you can advise someone coming up who maybe hasn't done both and have the benefit of a long career? What's a tip to someone in marketing who wants to better understand sales for like the best way that they can go about gaining your superpower?
Become a salesperson for 12 months. Carry a bag. Do the job.
Nice, simple. Another question for you. This is a bit more fun. What's the biggest fuck up in your career?
Oh, definitely losing the company when I was 28 because I thought I knew it all. That's an easy one. I absolutely fucked that up, and it was basically my own arrogance that got in the way of it. But like I say, out of bad comes good, and every cloud has a silver lining. The silver lining is I learned so much from that experience that I'll tell you what, I'm not going to fuck it up like that again.
If you could go back in time to, I think you said it was 28-year-old Louis who's just starting that business, what would you say to him?
Don't change anything. I mean it. It's like the lessons that I learned. I wouldn't have learned those lessons. I wouldn't be sitting here now. I don't regret any of it. It's all been part of a learning experience. And again, I was reading something by an ex-boss of mine this morning, a chap called Thijs van Santen, and it really resonated with me. It's not the destination, it's the journey you take to get there. And it's very true. The journey is what makes us. If you don't do the hard yards and you don't have the hard knocks, you'll never learn anything to be resilient about it in the future.
I think the challenge is when you're in there and you kind of feel it, like it's something I struggle with massively, like trying to found a business, right? You're doing something that you don't really know how to do. Yes, you can look back at it. You can either look at other people or look back at things when you've done that before with that very sensible perspective. It's so hard to tell yourself in the moment.
And this is where IBM used to talk about the DIKW pyramid. D, data, I, insight, K, knowledge, and at the top of that, W, wisdom. And it comes with lines here and grey hair here.
Nice. I need some of that then. Okay, and then final question before I let you go, Louis. Recommendation for everyone in terms of a book to read, a podcast to listen to, a thought leader to follow.
Well, the podcast is an easy one. The What's Broken in GTM and How to Fix It podcast with myself and Simon Daniels. That was easy. And then, in all seriousness, the one that I'm really, really into at the moment is Diary of a CEO by Stephen Bartlett. It's absolutely fascinating. He's got some amazing guests. So that's definitely a podcast to listen to. The other one, and I'm going to do two podcasts because I can't help myself, is Trip and Trip US. So the rest is politics and the rest is politics US. If you like car crash television, that's it. Then the books, again, I've pointed to it already, but it's not that it's a great read. It isn't, but it's got some nuggets in there that are fantastic. But I would point towards The Long and the Short of It by Binet and Field. It's worth reading as a marketer. It's worth reading as a revenue leader because then you get a perspective on a couple of different things. But the other thing that I would read right now, or certainly get a hold of a copy of and go through it, is Revenue Architecture by Jacco van der Kooij. Really, really good. So hopefully that's a few tips.
Yeah, and for people at home who don't like books, Jacko's done some really good podcasts as well, which is where I learned about the whole kind of revenue architecture methodology. So if you like to have it spoken to you, he's great at that.
Or watch him on YouTube. The energy is insane.
Nice. Okay, I'll look forward to that then. Cool, Louis, thank you so much for joining us. It's been really interesting to pick your brain. Normally at this point, I ask if there's anything that you would like to plug, but you've cheated and you've done that already, so I'm not going to give you that opportunity again. That's payback. But yeah, it's been a pleasure. Thank you for joining us, and everyone listening, thank you for listening.
No, thank you for having me on board, Tom. Really appreciate the opportunity.